All right. Hello, everyone. In today's video, I'll be talking about heavy models for policy debates. When I started out debating, I was always encouraged to be very specific with how the motion would manifest in the real world. Naturally, we argue better when we are more detailed about what we are talking about, and debates are usually of a higher quality when both sides are debating on the same page. And I think this advice is helpful as it eventually applies to all types of debates. So it's no surprise that policy debates are usually a good starting point for newer speakers when they are teaching this advice. For the purposes of this lecture, the policy debates that I am referring to are the motions that are explicitly worded as a this house would motion, where opening government is given leeway to develop an explicit model for how the policy will be enacted. This includes the when, where, how, what, and all the other salient details for what will happen in the debate or in the motion. And as I mentioned frequently, this is distinct from a this house believes that X should do motion, as while it still may involve a policy or a model. The key difference is that debaters can meaningfully argue on the terms of what the most likely policy is in how X may behave. On the other hand, a this house would motion involves a policy that is implemented by the government or a specified actor, and opening government's model is essentially the model that the debate will be bound to until the very end. No other speaker other than the Prime Minister can outline the specific details of this policy. In any case, a lot of what I'll say in this video will also reflect the tips that you can use for other model debates, so I think that this will also apply to this house believes that motions, but it's still focused on this house would type of motion. Having said this, I want to discuss in depth a particular phenomenon in debating with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. A common question that is asked is, how detailed should my model be? And one of the answers that you may encounter is, you should be as detailed as you can, provided you are within the reasonable constraints of the motion. And of course, the answer does give the option for opening government to develop what I would call a heavy model, where a model is heavily safeguarded and pronged in order to potentially increase the strength of opening government's policy. Furthermore, instead of thinking of it as a matter of how much you are adding to the model, think of it as different leverage points to cover your ground on a defensive level and to give you argumentative supplements to battle the other team on an offensive level. So that's why it's called a beefy or a heavy model, in my opinion. Right now, I want to go over some particular modeling strategies that you can incorporate into your own speeches. First, you may add a component to your model in order to induce a direct and mutually exclusive clash. In other words, you want to narrow down the debate as early as possible by focusing on one particular aspect of the debate that op cannot necessarily co-opt. So how would you do this? The answer simply is by preempting all of the things that they may attempt to co-opt as an alternative solution and adding it to your model so long as it is not something that you have to specifically oppose. Now, I realize that's a long sentence and it's a lot to take in. So let's start with a very basic example. If the motion were, this house would ban junk food in schools, you might argue about the harms of junk food at a very young age and how young individuals may not be capable to manage their diet on their own. So naturally, opposition might employ a strategy of agreeing that junk food is a problem, but that a ban would be ineffective. They might even validly argue that children can just eat more junk food at home, and so we should teach them to say no to junk food while they are in school. And so instead, to teach this behavior, opposition might counterpropose to have a very strong campaign in school to tell kids to be judicious with their consumption of junk food. So their argument is on moderation and teaching kids how to manage their diet instead of banning junk food altogether. So, given this scenario, if you are opening government, in order to preempt this stance and counter model, you would simply add a dimension to your model that states the following. A. we will meaningfully phase out junk food in schools over the course of a month and gradually replace each food stall with healthy alternatives. 2. We will do this alongside an informational campaign in school, and we will even provide discounts and benefits to students that are able to show that they've purchased from these healthy alternative stalls. And lastly, we will even provide food stubs for students that bring packed lunch that are of healthy varieties, which would implicitly encourage parents to already change their food environment at home. These three mechanisms preempt any opposition attempt to co-opt a campaign of moderation. Rather, what we prove is that the ban is instrumental for these mechanisms to work. So here, opposition would have to narrow down their clash as to why a ban uniquely is harmful. And in my opinion, in this scenario, they should have to talk about the importance of having a prevalent junk food environment in school, as it mimics the real world better and would be a better environment to simulate food choice behavior too. So it's still a fair debate. It's still a very fair debate, but of course, opening government did excellent work already here to preempt any attempt from opposition to co-opt this stance and try and co-opt any policy for their own benefit. Second, you may add components to your model that allow you to nuance your own argument. I want to point out here that you don't need to make new policy motions out of thin air, since this exercise is not really about expanding the motion, because by then you're not debating the debate anymore. Rather, think about what is inherent to the policy and how the fulfillment of this policy must imply the possibility of these components to your model. And it is only when you specify these that you are able to meaningfully leverage them for your own argument. A very popular example is the motion this House would impose an expiration date on marriage. One would expect that this debate would include a comparison between short expired versus long permanent marriages. And Op may enter the debate thinking that all they would have to defend is a permanently long marriage and that expired marriages ruin relationships and cut them off unnecessarily. And it causes instability in relationships. However, if you were opening government, a very powerful component that you can add to the model, which should have been obvious, by the way, but is actually very difficult to spot out on first reading, is just to simply say that you would allow individuals to renew their marital vows and rewrite their marital contracts at the point of expiration or the point of expiry. So now, you've substantially buffed up your own argument on the quality of these relationships. Instead of just saying that expiration dates are good to allow for better planning in general, these expiration dates also provide good milestone markers to renew contracts and give couples more flexibility to make relationship decisions that they wouldn't have been capable to make if they were just young and making a lifetime commitment early on in the marriage. So here you can even argue that your marriages are more stable and more long-term as opposed to the short-lived marriages that die to divorce much faster on opposition. This is one of my favorite examples. Third, you may add several components to your model to layer the mechanisms of the policy. Include the incentives of different stakeholders that may lead to the rise of these other supporting institutions and mechanisms. Add the dimensions of timing and other different sources of activity. The important reminder here is to remember that you should do this within reasonable fiat, which is to say that you only employ this as long as it is inherent to the resources required to enact the policy that is stated in the motion. An example, if the motion were this House would legalize the sale of organs, you can already likely foresee arguments from opposition on the possibility of coercion, or even a more sophisticated argument on the monopolization of the pricing of this market from the healthcare industry. If you were opening government, you can significantly weaken these arguments with the following model. A. We will institute an independent government agency that will oversee a transparent public market with an auction-like bidding process in which the prospective sellers can offer their organs and approve transactions if they are satisfied with the prices of the highest bid prices in this model. This resolves any information asymmetry problems that may arise in a closed market. 2. Second, we will have a 3-confirmation process for prospective sellers. They must consent during different phases of the buying process, each separated by at least 1 month, since this naturally takes time to confirm the viability of the organ and the compatibility with the buyer. And lastly, we will also offer public attorneys to be available to oversee the contract writing and transaction process to mitigate any possibility of scamming. The key to the effectiveness of this model is that what we are essentially doing is highlighting incentive mechanisms within the model creation process. Governments have an incentive to institute this transparent public market and auction process, and buyers and sellers will likely mutually agree to participate in this. The same applies to the existence of a 3-phase confirmation process and the existence of public attorneys. These are not necessarily controversial, and neither are they against the spirit of the motion. They only serve to make the policy more appealing and detailed. One important note to make here is that you should always be aware of the strategic concessions that you may be making when you are adding components to your model that may undermine your case more than help your case. There's really no definite rule here, since it always depends on how you want to formulate the argument, but one guide that I like to keep in mind is, if this component was included in the model, would I still be able to run my argument at full hardline strength? If the answer is no, then just drop it. For example, if we were doing the motion a while ago on the sale of organs, then you might have noticed that if we really push through with this 3-phase confirmation process, then we are also possibly undermining the argument that some of these individuals need money immediately and as soon as possible. So we are delaying the acceptance of payment. Sure, you can probably come up with a response to say that payments can be forwarded in some of these instances, but in reality, it probably might have just been better to just go hardline and say that we are willing to make these transactions as soon as possible as well. But then again, right, this is still a trade-off, because it's probably equally true that putting safeguards to the transaction process is something governments do all the time to mitigate impulsive decisions, which is a parallelism as to why this policy might be consistent with other policies that government has. So it's all a matter of which trade-offs you want to accept and which model you think suits the arguments that you might want to make in the future. So what is my final assessment on heavy models in debates? Rather than dismissing all heavy models outright or encouraging everyone to develop a heavy model, I think the question boils down to one of strategy. If your use of this strategy increases your chances to win the round, then by all means, go for it. I think this is an excellent plan, so long as the team that employs them is able to stick to the strategy that they have employed. So make sure that you give yourself sufficient room to play around your own strategy. Otherwise, as we mentioned in this video, this effort would be pointless and self-defeating. In any case, heavy models do provide opening government with a lot of maneuverability in policy debates. And in most instances, I do recommend that you should use each and every detail in your policy as an opportunity to enhance your argument and actively preempt and respond to other teams in the debate. After all, don't just add details for the sake of adding details. You want to use these details to leverage your argument. This is simply one other tool that you have to comprehensively control the round like no other team can in the debate. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thank you everyone and have a great day. Goodbye.